We're going to start with session 3, which is raising the bar in the South African industry, benchmarking the South African industry. What is measured can, of course, be improved. I'm going to ask the chairman, Paul Clark, to join us on stage. The team is Jean Winter, Lise van der Merwe, and Stefan Schumann. Put your hands together, why not?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the graveyard shift. I hope it's not a case of mag is vol, oog is toe, so please pay attention. To benchmark is to evaluate or check by comparison with the standard. The way in which we are farming is changing. The modern farm is based on information and technology. Growers are increasingly farming with data alongside their macadamia trees, and this will only increase in the future. Growers will rely heavily on data and technology for information-specific practices, which helps them to farm smarter and not harder, to improve yields and quality for higher profits. But having the data available is only the first step. The value add is only achieved when you use it effectively. Information enables growers to take guessing and emotions out of their decision-making by rather relying on data. Benchmarking relies on keeping accurate data and helps growers to measure the outcomes when they have made improvements or implemented changes. Benchmarking also enables growers to compare themselves with the industry. Best practices can arise from documenting which actions led to successful outcomes. Besides its use in benchmarking or comparing, the real value is only realized when information is integrated. Growers are encouraged to start committing to documenting and measuring themselves for their own future prosperity. I'd like to introduce you to your first speaker of this session, Jean Winter from Source BI. Source BI is an independent agricultural data analytics company. Having worked closely with SAMAC for multiple years on various projects, including the SAMAC loss factor benchmark and the Macadamia production benchmark. The production benchmark, which started in 2019, is currently standing on 6,200 hectares of macadamias and growing rapidly. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Paul. Good afternoon, ladies and gents. I just want to check if this thing works. Let's see. There we go. All right. Thank you for having me. It's a wonderful privilege, and it's always fun to be with all the macadamia growers and all the stakeholders. It's a great thing for us to be part of the Mac industry, and with the specific project that I'm going to talk about today, I just want to say we are having the most fun working through all of this data. It is phenomenal. We are maybe a little bit of ultra nerds, but I think Dr. Elsie Hubert and Dr. Lise van der Merwe, they're more nerdy than me. But me and Vian, waar is jy? There you go. Key personnel. Just want to say thank you for putting together this presentation in a short time. It looks great, and let's run through it. So I just want to give you some feedback on the production benchmark. How it started off. We met with a couple of our Avo growers, and there was a great need to measure them on the macadamia side as well. And they said, guys, you need to get in, you need to start doing this for our macadamia business. It's a big part of our companies. I said, yeah, sure, it's fine, but we need a lot of growers. We need a lot of growers to make it work. Benchmarking is only as good as your data pool. You need a big data pool. If you don't have a big data pool, benchmarking means squat. All right, so we said, okay, right, let's start. So we got a couple of growers on the benchmark. Started with year 1. That was 11 months ago today. 3,300 hectares. We were blown away. That was unbelievable. We started with a really big group. We put ourselves in a position where we said, okay, we're going to try and put some aggressive goals for ourselves. And as Paul mentioned just now, we're currently sitting at just above 6,300 hectares. So it's just growing phenomenally, and we're getting excited about it because the information that we get is becoming better and better and better, especially for growers in their own regions, specifically in their own grow regions. And this is fundamentally important because every region has its own set of variables, and you want to compare against growers in the same kind of setup, all right? Same soil types, same climatic conditions, same input providers, etc. Okay, so running through the benchmark, I'm going to go over it very quickly. I'm going to skip the loss factor benchmark for today because I want to focus on the production benchmark. But looking at age distribution, that provides context as to how we can compare ourselves as a grower against some other growers. The age distribution of your trees, that determines everything. Your production cost, your yield, your quality, everything is determined by your distribution of trees and how old those trees are. All right. Secondly, we go to yield. We normalize for age, and then we compare on a like-for-like basis. And then thirdly, we go to quality. We do an analysis on your sound and your unsound kernel. Regardless of which processor you go to, it's about what's happening on your farm. It's a farm-focused benchmark, right? And then number 5, income per kilogram. That is directly correlated to your sound kernel. So the higher your sound kernel, the better prices you can get. The higher your unsound kernel, the more you get penalized at factory level because there's a cost implication to it. All right, and that drives all the way to income per hectare. And finally, we look at production costs, looking at the main production cost items to set up said crop at said quality. All right, and then you can calculate a gross margin, and that's what it's all about. So we've got some extremely clever people in the audience, and the researchers focusing on the technical side. We as agricultural economists, we focus on the rand and cents. That's what matters to us, all right? But it needs to be at a sustainable level. So maximizing your income per hectare over the long run, not short term, right? Okay, so let's get into it. And I'm going to use this laser pointer here. All right, so this is our study of about 6,200, 6,300 hectares. And what you immediately can see is that of the 27 producers that's participating in this study, from South Coast, North Coast, Barberton, Nelspruit, Kiepersol, White River area, and then Zinc and Levubu, we've got growers across the board. Of the group, more than 50% of the orchards are younger than 6 years of age. All right? So already, when we think about the cost of production, to quantify the cost of production is already extremely difficult because your trees are still young. All right. So within a specific entity, we've got a lot of young trees affecting the cost of that production. And then that is up till 30 years and older trees, mostly by our more mature grower areas like Levubu, Zinc, which we call Letaba, and also Barberton, which is also a very mature area compared to White River, North Coast, South Coast. All right. So these are the ages of trees that we're going to use to determine how you are comparing on a ton per hectare level, and then these we're going to exclude to a large extent because it's not at a comparable level as yet. Okay, so, and the distribution, Beaumont's at about 36%, Intex 42%, which is mostly comprised of in the older mature areas, it's mostly the old intake varieties. The new plantings in our benchmark study of 6,300, mostly 816s, 814s, and then a lot of the new hybrid cultivars as well. All right. So that paints a picture. Now, of those 6 grower regions that I mentioned, 6 or 7, 2019's ton per hectare we normalize for tree age, 9-year and older trees. Benchmark, dry and shell, tons per hectare, 3 tons, 3.05. All right, 2019. 2020, 25% drop to 2.3 tons per hectare. That was our benchmark average for mature trees in 2020 was 2.3 tons per hectare. And then another 11% drop off in 2020. This year, we just finished the data on 2021. 2 tons per hectare flat. Dry and shell for 9-year and older trees across Beaumont's Intex hybrids across all our grower regions. All right. So that's a phenomenal downward trend in income, and that's why, as you just saw, the levy income decreased, because the actual ability of even mature trees decreased significantly. Even with all the new trees coming into production, still, there was a extreme decrease. All right. So, going forward, some interesting information on the yield side. This is where we grouped the 3-year average dry and shell by grow region. So on the left, you've got Nelspruit Kiepersol over a 3-year period, outperforming at about 3 tons flat. If you asked me this question a month ago, I would have said it would be much lower down. But now things are changing. By adding more years worth of data, we are seeing the broader picture. And long-term crop farming is it's a game of averages. It's about the long-term game, right? So, we got a couple of, I don't know what that means. All right, so interesting. Our 3-year average, 2.5 tons per hectare dry and shell. You'll see Levubu on the far right, struggling over the last 3 years at 1.5 tons per hectare. KZN North and South, there in the middle at about 2.8, 2.7 tons per hectare. Jumping forward, going to kernel recovery, the benchmark as a total, sound kernel recovery of about 33.3% compared to our loss factor benchmark, where it's about 32%, 32.5%, with an unsound kernel of 2.6%. All right, where sound kernel driving your income, unsound kernel having a cost implication, and you're getting penalized for that. And then the total kernel recovery about 35.9 across those 3 years. When we talk about sound kernel, this is where the big difference comes in. And when we talk about income per hectare, this is the next section. After your yield, your sound kernel recovery is going to determine your price to a large extent. And so this is where we see KZN North and South really excelling. We're getting a 3-year average of 37 and 38% on the coastal areas. Over there, then you've got Barberton and Nelspruit Kiepersol about 33, 34%. And then you've got your Levubu and Letaba areas averaging about 27, 28%. So now we're starting to get a multiplier effect going. We've got yields, now we multiply that with our kernel recovery to get effective sound kernel farmed and produced. We've got I call it an industry average, but it's a benchmark average. Benchmark average of about 33.3. So now we're starting to multiply. It's a multiplier effect, right? So let's go on to the next slide. A quick look at unsound kernel recovery. And this is where our Limpopo region is being punished. We've got Levubu and Letaba at about 4.9 and 5.2%, with KZN South there at 1.7, Barberton and Nelspruit there at about 1.8 and 1.9, and KZN North at about 2% over the last 3 years. Okay, so heavy cost implication in the north at the coastal areas, low, as well as the unsound kernel in Nelspruit and White River and Kiepersol and Barberton, quite low and under control. So I'm just going to jump this slide. Now, sound kernel, as I said, determines to a large extent your price. Okay. 2019, multiplied by exchange rate, obviously. You remember those days. And dollar selling price. 2019, the average of all our grower regions back on farm income per kilogram, dry and shell, about 74 Rand. The year after, exchange rate went up to about even 19, I think 19 to the dollar. 2020, we got returns of about 83, 84 Rand per kilogram across all our grower regions. But within the grower regions, it is vastly different. So we're not sure what's going to happen with the 2021 price yet. Exchange rate hasn't been in our favor. Dollar prices were under pressure, but we're going to wait for the agterskot to finalize, probably by next year, and then we'll see what effect 2021 crop that was down, a little bit better quality, what effect that's going to have on our final price per kilogram. But this is where it comes together, all right? We see age distribution of trees multiplied by yield per hectare, multiplied by sound kernel, matched with the sound kernel price per kilogram, well, that determines the price per kilogram. This is just our regional averages, and that's what I said. You know, KZN North and South, because of the high sound kernel crackouts, returning back on farm, 97 Rand, KZN North, 94 Rand per kilogram dry and shell over the last 2 years. Remember I said we don't have 2021's data yet, it's still coming. So above the 95 Rand per kilogram back on farm mark. Barberton and Nelspruit with a sound kernel of about 33, 34, back on farm of about 80 Rand, 77, that's our benchmark group. And then Limpopo with a high unsound kernel recovery and low sound kernels, really under pressure on the pricing side, averaging about 56 Rand a kilogram back on farm, with a benchmark average of about 78. So regionally, coastal areas, Mpumalanga, Limpopo, vastly different, okay? And that brings us to our income per hectare, where we normalize, we filter out in the benchmark, we filter out trees aged 0 to 8, and we look at only 9-year and older trees. So it's not full bearing, but we classify it as full bearing at 9 years. And now we're saying, okay, tons per hectare, multiplied by your sound kernel, multiplied by the price, and there you get your back on farm income per hectare. KZN South in 2019 and 2020, 350,000 Rand a hectare, back on farm income. Next up, KZN North, under pressure on the yield side, good crackouts and good prices, 250,000 Rand a hectare across in those 2 years, 2019 and 2020. Nelspruit Kiepersrol, good yields, right there in the middle, sound kernel prices right there in the middle, 250,000 comparing with KZN North. Letaba, 220,000 Rand a hectare. And I've got some comments regarding that, and I'll tell you now. Barberton, they had about 215,000 Rand a hectare, and then Levubu, over those 2 years, really under pressure. Low yields with low crackouts, high unsound kernel recovery, therefore low back on farm price, and therefore below the 100,000 Rand a hectare mark. But now what we're seeing is, now that we're slotting in a 3rd year's worth of data, things are changing. Our benchmark group is growing. We've got some big growers in certain areas that are really mixing things up. We've got some growers in Letaba, big growers coming onto the benchmark with extremely high yields, offsetting that negative effect of the lower sound kernels and the price, and still being competitive. And that's what we can see there. And also, slotting in 2021's results, we saw that some of the growers in Levubu have managed in the 2021 crop to get their older mature trees, that's, let's say, 25 years and older, to really produce very, very well and being extremely competitive. So we are, by this benchmarking, by showing some points, we are seeing things change. Growers are really changing, and they are collaborating. The South Coast guys are collaborating on our benchmark platform, and they are picking up the phone and talking to the neighbors and saying, okay, what are you doing on that cultivar? So this is really phenomenal. Okay, and then lastly, to get to your gross margin, production cost. So we've said, okay, we normalize again for tree age. So we filtered on all, this was a difficult one, but we filtered on all entities or companies that has a weighted average tree age of 5 years and older, because we can't connect cost per tree age. In the financial system, it's not connected. But on weighted average, we know what your average age of your farm is. And based on that, we filtered out all the young farms aged 5 and less. And there, our benchmark production cost per hectare at almost 60,000, 58, which is labor. You see labor harvest there, although there might be some cross-pollination between labor and harvesting cost. So you can actually stack the two on top of each other. Chemicals at about 10,000 Rand, fertilizer at about 9,200 Rand, maintenance of tractors, vehicles, pumps, everything, 7,300 Rand, electricity 4,000 Rand, fuel 3,500 Rand, and then other is a small production cost item which includes your bee costs, beekeeping and tool hire and those type of things. That gives us a good idea of regionally what your gross margin is. And we can see, given the 2 years worth of data that we have, The coastal areas, Nelspruit still being very competitive, Limpopo being a bit under pressure, but that's changing. And that's what we are very, very excited about. Okay, this is our benchmark platform. It's online. And SAMAC is going to send you the link. So you just go onto the link, sourcebi.co.za. You use the username mac@samac.co.za and the password samac10500. You log in and you get access to this benchmark. SAMAC provided some funding for all growers to the idea is to get more growers to participate in this benchmark study so that the data pool can grow. But this is phenomenal information that we are really excited about. And we want you guys to go play around with this model. Tonight, sit on your phone, sit on your laptop, on your tablet, go click through Intex, hybrids, see how it affects the yields, the growth curve, everything is on there. There's tons of data. But I'm going to stop there so that we can save some time. Thanks.
Thank you, Jean. I do really encourage all growers to utilize that live link that SAMAC has made available. Maybe not right now, we might bomb out the internet, but later on this evening. And as a grower as well, you're able to dive into your own personal data versus the other people on the benchmark. Our next speaker is Lisa Fundame from Feltology. Feltology is a new company started in 2020 that helps growers and foresters improve their management operations. They do that by combining best available science and farmers' practical experience into easy-to-use tools that can be used to identify gaps in the management system and then suggest ways for improvement. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much for having me. It's a great privilege, and I'm looking forward to see how we can work together to make the Mac industry better. Right, so jumping straight in, we heard about the differences that exist between different producers, and we know that some of these differences in production and quality are tied to a specific region. But some of those differences are also tied to specific management practices of what one farmer does, but another one doesn't. And the Feltology tool is about delving into those management differences that makes a good farmer great. Right, so we heard about the nut production, the quality, the market access. That's the kind of data that Source BI provides. You probably also saw the Future Orchard stall outside. And where I fit in is those differences in management. So we know that there are various factors influencing production and quality, but the Feltology tool then considers the management system on a farm. So we know that there are different paradigms, there are different ways of looking at farming, there are also different philosophies of farming, and that's also all influencing the operations that happen on the ground day to day at farm level, but also at block level. So what we are trying to do is we are figuring out this management system. We've got planning, we've got doing, we've got checking, and then we've got acting or adapting according to the ISO system. And then we just want to tease out where are these gaps, where can you improve, and where you can make a real difference in your production on your farm. So just a brief overview of the tool. We basically have 4 steps. So firstly, identifying the management operations that drive production and quality, and I'll briefly talk to each of these steps. Then we'll unpack these management practices into closed-ended questions that also define best practice. And I should say that I'm not working on my own on this. We are actively collaborating with the farmers, with the consultants, and drawing that collective expertise into what we consider as best practice. So just to clarify, a closed-ended question is basically where you have a predefined answer. So it's where you ask, did you attend the SAMAC Macadamia Day? And you say yes or no. And that answer, what you actually did, that's compared with best practice. It's then very simply just, calculated into a score, and that's reported on a very nifty-looking graph that I'll also show to you. But firstly, the management operations. So we know that there are basic practices that everyone needs to do right. And I just listed them there. And they come through all the way from land prep all the way to dehusking. But then in addition to these basic practices, we've got the enhancing practices, which we've touched on quite significantly this morning. So that's your cover crops, it's your integrated pest management. It's whether you mulch, whether you do vertical mulching or just top mulching, different ways of looking at soil compaction, whether you have a problem with soil erosion, you know, those additive things that can possibly give you market access or better market access in future. So then this is just an example of the questions that we ask. You can see they are very simple, they are very logical, and they are very intuitive, and you can see where we are going. So was there an annual survey of tree height? What about radius? Then insect pest sprays, we know the effect of that. What was the effective height, and how is that effective spray height for your insect control comparing to tree height? So it's very logical. And just using those questions, you can also see where you're going right, where you're going wrong, and what you need to do to change and to get better. So this is just a diagram to show, you know, how we're doing it, and it's so self-explanatory. So there will be these questions. There are so many of them at the moment. I think we are close to 300, but there will also be an elimination process that I'll speak to you later again. So you get a question, you answer them, yes or no. That answer is compared to best practice, and then based on that, you will get a compliance score of 0 or 1. And we did this for forestry. We developed a similar tool for the forestry industry. There's different ways of using that data, but the graph that I'm showing you next is what the foresters on the ground are most passionate about. And it's just very simply, on the x-axis, you've got the level of compliance, so 0 to 1. And then on the y-axis, you've got the questions. Now, these questions are not applicable to you, but we will develop something similar for the Mac industry. And then also, very simply, you can immediately see at a glance where your gaps are. It doesn't even need explanation. It's just so intuitive. So these graphs you can use to report compliance with best practice. We can also use it to learn from one another, to compare notes and see, you know, A versus B. What did you do differently? And it also creates that opportunity of different people experimenting on their own farms. And then you don't have to repeat the mistakes that your neighbor made. You can learn from their mistakes. And then hopefully we'll also see improvements over time. So next steps are farmers' involvement, and we are already in the process. We've already worked with some of the guys in the Nelspruit area and KwaZulu-Natal. And thank you so much for listening and sharing your expertise in helping us build this tool. Joanne also sent out an email to some of the Source BI producers, and we'll involve those farmers as well, and then anyone else that would like to participate, we'll probably get to you at some point and figure out how we can do this. Along with this farmer involvement and sharing of expertise and learning from one another and combining, you know, on the ground practical experience with science, we've got the analytical side. So we've got the number crunching, the analysis. And remember I told you about those 300 questions that we still need to bring down? That's the next step. So this combination of farmer involvement and the analytics we'll use to narrow down those 300 questions down to a number that you can handle, you know, that will maybe, you know, we talk about the handful of factors, the handful of questions, which might not be 5, but we'll talk about the handful of questions. And then from those, we are hoping to identify those factors limiting production quality in your specific region. So that's where we're heading, and hopefully by next year, this time, we'll have some very exciting data to show you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Our next speaker and final speaker for this session is Stefan Schumann. Stefan Schumann is easily one of the strongest consultants on macadamias in South Africa at the moment. And I'd like to highlight this. And to highlight this, I'd like to share a few insights about him from his peers. Hardworking, genuine, and honest is all they can say. wants to do the right thing, and has no other objective than making people improve themselves. He has a unique ability to understand the needs of a grower, as his experience has taken him from farm manager to lecturer, and then to farm owner and consultant. Thank you, Stefan.
Dankie, Paul. How many of you are have orchards that produce 7 tons and more per hectare? Try and show. One very calm person. It's amazing the information that is available in the Landbouweekblad sphere. And the reality is that 400 of us don't have that experience generally. But we need to understand, and we can start building our information bases by these tools that Jean and Lisa spoke about. And I must say, it is really exciting, the things that are already coming out of that. So we have started farming with bees 9,000 years ago. Earthen vessels. We started farming with peaches 8,000 years ago in the Yangtze River Valley. We started farming with citrus about 3,500 years ago. And we're farming with macadamias officially for 140 years. So the level of data that is available historically is smaller for macadamias. And interestingly enough, some of the norms that we have, not all of them, were developed in a time where things were different. Climate was predictable, or maybe. Irrigation technology was different. Irrigation volumes was set. We all knew 540 liters per tree per week. Fertilization and fertilizer technology, a focus on specific elements, big and few applications of fertilizer. We planted at different spacings. We planted in nice subtropical areas and not in the areas that we plant today. We had very different monitoring technology. And we had clean orchard floors. So all of these things or many of them are changing. And on top of that, we are generating loads and loads of data. Now, a last quick survey. Who of you has started your bird list for the trip so far? See, the information that we gather sometimes is really interesting. But can we convert that bird list into an actionable recommendation? There's an old Afrikaans adage that you all know, om te meet is om te weet. And I think we make bird lists and then we file them. It's not always helpful just to know. We measure to know, but we actually measure to improve. That's the intention of what we are doing. And to be able to improve, we have to be able to evaluate. We start with an input. We do something, and then there is a result. So the thing that we do, we call a recommendation. Okay, I want to do a specific thing, and therefore I either follow the advice that someone gave me, or I wake up early and think about it in the shower. But I make a plan, call it a recommendation. Then I implement it. Myself, labor, somebody does it. There's tools, there's a system, there's a tractor that starts. There's an implementation of whatever the thing is that I want to achieve. Then I monitor what I do. So monitoring is calculating the volume of yield that you have, checking your probe for your irrigation purposes. Monitor yourself by taking leaf samples once a year. The types of monitoring tools that we have available is significantly different than 10 years ago. But now we have a stack of data, especially if I don't know if who of you are receiving weekly NDVI data of your farm. It's real stacks of data. And how do I use it? So the only real way to evaluate ourselves with through these stacks of data is through software. Databases, understanding the history. We're working with a multi-year crop that everything that I do this year has an impact on next year and the year after. Everything that I didn't do this year has an impact on next year and the year after. So the tool that I use is called Agriwiz. It's a database. It transitioned out of an Excel program in 2007. It turned to a cloud-based database in 2012. And we have just recently transitioned from basically an R&D version to a commercial version. There's currently 8,500 macadamia seasons on the program in the database, and there's various consultants that use the program. We monitor a lot of things. I'm not going to go into much detail here. Climatic monitoring, irrigation, the system that you use, the volumes, leaf soil water analyses, the actual implementation, the fertilizer recommendations that you use, and then we monitor yields and we record applications, etc. All of these things have an impact on yield, but to make it interesting, they have an impact on each other as well. To optimize production is really a complex level of things that interact with each other. Trying to understand soil biology just adds another layer here. Before I go to nutrition, to just illustrate, to make an irrigation recommendation was very simple a couple of years ago. We know that macadamia crop factor is 0.6, 0.7, depending on area, maybe 0.8. So if we have an evaporation of 4 millimeters in a day, then it's quite simple. If my crop factor is 0.75, I know I have to irrigate 3 millimeters per day. If I have 300 trees on a hectare, 3 mils is 30,000 liters. It's 100 liters a tree a day. Very simple to do because we know the answer. The reality is, when we set up a plan like that, and then we monitor what we are actually doing, we're applying water, we have probes that guide us, we check ourselves, we suddenly find that we are not even getting to 2 millimeters of water applied for most of the year. There is 6, that's 0.6 mils. This is a specific situation. It is drip irrigated macadamias in the Plaston region. So there is some realities about that. But the recommendation was significantly higher than the actual application. And the only reason we know this is because we monitored. And because of that, we can now recommend a lower volume of water for the specific orchard. Incidentally, when we started monitoring in 2016, it overlapped with a study that SAMAC and the WRC funded, and we were all very concerned when Tienus and colleagues found that macadamia water use is lower than what we anticipated. And this empirical data that was on farm supported that. When we monitor EC, electrical conductivity, call it the level of nutrition in the soil, specifically maybe for drip irrigation growers, when we monitor, we see there is a lot of fluctuation. So then you can ask yourself, how can I improve? How can I stabilize it to have a flatter line, to have a lower amplitude, lower stress levels on the trees? If I want to reduce it, how can I do it? How can I up it? And those questions we can ask the moment that we start monitoring and evaluating ourselves. If we do a very simple monitoring exercise, we do a soil analysis, and we aim to be within a certain norm value. Over years, when you implement recommendations, we start coming closer to the norm. You can see that we funnel in this specific case, the soil is coming closer to the norm. It's a process of analyze, recommend, implement recommendation, and reanalyze. So, when I set up nutritional norms, we start with an extraction value. What is the extraction value of macadamia? And it's a silly thing to ask because we are farming with macadamias for a number of years now, we should know. But SAMAC has funded Dr. Alicia Kleinert at Stellenbosch University this year to do an extended research project on different varieties, different growth areas to see exactly what we are taking out when we remove a specific size crop. We need to know what the reserve levels in the tree is, specifically referring maybe to leaf analysis. We sometimes think that the number on the leaf analysis, 0.6% calcium, is a number that you benchmark against. It's actually a dry weight volume. If it's 0.6%, then it means if you have a ton of dry matter in your orchard, 0.6% of that is calcium. So if my tree has grew from this size to that size, and I increased my canopy volume from 1 ton to 2 tons, did my calcium match up? Do I still have enough calcium in the plant? And how much do I need to apply to keep it at that level? History, really important to stick to your lab of choice, unless you have very good reason to change. You build a set of history, you build history on the farm, and everything that we do this year impacts on next year. The volume of fertilizer that we apply, and the starting points from where we go. Then the next question is, when do I apply fertilizers? And the answer to that question is depending on the tree phenology. But we can't always see what happens within the plant. We can't see flower initiation. We can't see reserve levels. So we need to support those physiological actions as well as the phenological actions. And then the final question about building a norm is how I apply the fertilizer. What is my philosophy? Am I doing it with compost only? Am I fertigating continuously through drippers? Am I applying fertilizers in a blend form 5 times a year? That influences the specific aims that you have. So this is the current macadamia leaf analysis norms that we have at our disposal. This is the SAMAC numbers. So these are typically the numbers somewhere between the SAMAC and the ARC numbers is what you will have on your lab reports. That's the revised Aussie numbers. Remember that when we have leaf analysis norms, there's a certain history involved. On what variety did the researcher work when he did the norm calculations? In which area did they work? How did they apply the fertilizer, etc. Andrew, I took one of your slides and I haven't asked. So this is out of a talk that Andrew did 3 years ago in China. Absolutely fantastic work that Sheard and colleagues did in KZN, analyzing leaf analysis in various varieties over various areas and on a monthly basis. And it points to the fact, when do I take my analysis? Traditionally, we take our analysis October, November. October in the hotter areas, November in the cooler areas. But sometimes we find that because of time constraints, service providers say, no, I'll take your samples in September. Or I miss the opportunity and I take the samples in March. How can I still use the same leaf analysis norm? And the answer to that question is definitely not. This is only for potassium, and you can see how the level of potassium changed in the leaf content over a year. So that depending on when you take the sample really influences what you're going to see in the plant. There's a lot of things happening in the tree at a specific time. And Andrew and his team is building norms for, at least for KZN, for specific timings. I must say I really like the idea of taking samples in March, April, coincides with the end of harvest, and is really the place where the tree is after harvest. So to make an impact on the tree at that time is good, but we don't have formal norms for that period yet. So, out of those data points that we have in Agriwiz, we can draw nice graphs like this spider one. It's a normalized graph rated on yield. The highest yields are the green lines here. The lowest yields are the red lines. Each of these lines is a specific element, in this case NPK, calcium, magnesium, etc. So if you analyze this data for, in this case, mature 816 trees, you get certain interesting trends. The main trend when I look at this is when we do a leaf analysis and our standard macadamia norms, we are testing if we have an straight A student, and Beaumont fits the bill. If you're in the norm, you get almost everything right, and you get a fairly good yield. But to get a good yield in any of the other varieties, the norm as it's currently standing is not perfectly suitable. And the patterns that we follow, or the patterns that come out of this data, is very interesting. We see iron needed more than what the norm says. And we see phosphate mostly lower than what the norm says. There's a lot of things that we can talk about this. A very recent article showed that the zinc iron interaction are even more interesting than what we thought, even more complex. Plants up and down regulate uptake of iron depending on the balance between the zinc and iron in the soil, and according to internal processes, they can eat themselves up internally to make zinc available. Very interesting. This is the current norms that we use as the industry for application of fertilizers. So in a typical orchard, this would be a recommendation, a base recommendation. But if you look at the data out of our set, we see that depending on where you are, different levels of nutrition is required. So without going into too much detail, maybe it's soil differences, maybe it's the climatic influences on the plant's phenology, but different areas require different volumes of potassium. So when we start asking when do I apply my 200 kilograms of potassium in Nelspruit, I have to ask when is it required? And the phenology of the plant depends on the climate, the variety, and how you manage it. And it's difficult to see how we influence phenology until you start thinking about when you harvest. If you delay your harvest, if you apply ethopon too late, you flower later, and it has knock-on effects. The placement of applications depend on this phenology that the environment and ourselves create on our farms. And this also leads us to understand that we cannot have a general norm for when to apply what around the country. I cannot apply potassium at the same time in Nelspruit as I do in Pongola or in Komatipoort or in George or in Mokopong. Recently, some interesting trends out of Australia shows that a larger nitrogen application in autumn may be something to consider. So how are we able to evaluate this? On top of this interesting complexity, new and extra data is becoming available continuously. Continuous logging moisture probes, EC probes now measuring every half an hour to an hour, precision soil mapping, NDVI and other remote sensing tools, Sap Analysis. If you do Sap Analysis, do you do it on your leaf PTL or do you do the whole leaf? And if you do either, remember that when you compare notes with your neighbor, that he should do it in the same way. Carbohydrate analysis, the importance of trace elements becoming more prominent again, molybdenum, cadmium, nickel, chlorine. Soil health parameters, we are starting to measure that, and we're starting to measure soil and biological systems. So when you measure, and I want to encourage you to measure, when lots of data is becoming available, make sure that you interpret it and use your time wisely, otherwise don't measure. And the intention of that measurement is to convert it into improvement. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. We're trying to make up a bit of time, but we do have some time for some questions. If you'd like to ask the speakers any questions, please raise your hands.
Good afternoon. I've got a question for Lisa, if that's okay. Lisa, if I understood correctly, you've kicked off and you've got a couple of growers already, and just wondering if there's any trends amongst them, anything that's jumping out at you yet, or is that perhaps a little bit premature?
It's complicated. To tie in with what Elsha said earlier, it really depends. So initially when we started with this, some of the earliest conversations we had was around these limiting factors. And, depending on whether you talk to a producer here or whether the guy is down in KZN, you might have issues with soil compaction or not. And the one guy will tell you, no, it's massively important. It's the most limiting factor. It's the difference between 4 and 5 tons per hectare. And the other guy tells you, no, land prep, soil compaction is not an issue. And I don't know if that's true, but that's that's what I'm hearing from the guys. So, and I think those limiting factors will be tied to specific regions, but I think it will also be tied to, your management system, whether you have a large corporate structure, what your revenue base is looking like, your capital, where your money comes from. So no easy answers at this point, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Any other questions?
Just to the whole panel, we've got various platforms available to us. So we've got Agriwiz, Jean, we've got your source. How do we integrate all of these different programs? And what value is it to all the farmers?
That's a difficult question. I think you'll see all of us have got this Future Orchard shirt on today, or a couple of us, Elsha as well. And that's what we're trying to do. We've realized that all of us are living on our own separate islands, and we just kind of come together and start combining resources. And that's why Lisa the Feltology tool is tapping into what Source BI is doing on the benchmarking to match up management practices with results. And we are tying that up with what Agriwiz is doing on the technical side, on day-to-day management with measuring, and then what was actually done, with the difference between recommendation and then application, because that's where the big difference comes in. So to answer your question, there's no silver bullet, one central program that does everything for everyone and pulls through the cost per hectare, per block, right through. We are way far from that. But I think we're at least at the point where we are starting to collaborate between different, let's call it companies at least, to say, well, let's start pooling the data. Let's get the answer that you are asking and match it with what the results that on this and with what you guys are measuring on the ground. I think that's we're working towards it. That's the plan, and SAMAC is really doing well to kind of help us and facilitate us through that process, because it is data everywhere, and to try and bring that together is extremely difficult. But we've got a phenomenal team working together to try and do that. Yeah.
Anything to add?
Yes, maybe just saying it's different pieces of the puzzle, and we're building that bigger picture. So with previous experience and with monitoring and scouting and so on, that gives one part of the picture. And then with the nutritional stuff, that's another part of the picture. Your economic stuff, that's another part of the picture. But slowly we are building a model where it all comes together, where all the different data streams come into one place, hopefully, sometime soon in future. We'll work on it. So that we can give you the holistic picture. And we can tell you, okay, so this is happening and this is why.
Thank you, Lisa. I think it's important as well that, just to reiterate, that the growers start to measure and you start to collect the data and make certain that that data is relevant. If it's not relevant, it's pointless, really. You're wasting your time and you're wasting anyone's time who you share that data with as well. Thank you.